Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening.
Early the next morning, Frida hurried to the airport. She had received a text from Sean the night before stating that he would be returning with that legendary doctor. Frida was so excited that she barely slept. The moment the sun peeked over the horizon, she got up, dressed up, and left the house right on time. Around 10 minutes after she arrived at the airport, she spotted the striking Sean in the crowd. Because of Sean's impressive aura and height, he was always an eye-catching presence wherever he went. In fact, a lot of people around him were staring at him, as they thought he was a celebrity. When Frida saw Sean walking toward her, her heart began to race. As he came to a stop in front of her, she held back her exhilaration and greeted, "You're back." After giving her a once-over, Sean curled his lips and remarked, "You look pretty today." Frida instantly blushed, feeling at a loss for what to respond. Let me do the introductions. This is old Mr. Lomax, the king of medicine of Morania, who has lived in seclusion for years." Turning to Peregrine Lomax, Sean said respectfully, "Old Mr. Lomax, this is Frida Queen, the granddaughter of the Queen family." Frida's attention was focused on Sean all this time. It was only when Sean began speaking that she realized there was an old man beside him. The old man was thin, and he was considerably tall, as he was just a few centimeters shorter than Sean. Though his face was wrinkly with age, his eyes gleamed coldly and made him look aloof. From the way he carried himself, one could easily see that he was no ordinary man. Moreover, Sean clearly treated him with high regard. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Peregrine," Frida hurriedly greeted politely. Peregrine glanced at her indifferently and replied, "I've seen you when you were young, but I'd prefer you not call me that. Just call me old Mr. Lomax, like this young man from the Crawford family." Frida's smile stiffened at that. She only addressed Peregrine that way because she wanted to cotton up to him. Jonathan owned access to the Queen family's connections now. Naturally, Frida wanted to develop her own network as well. To her surprise, the old man before her was way too stubborn. Sean shot Frida a look just then, so she had no choice but to agree meekly. "I understand, old Mr. Lomax." Nodding slightly, Peregrine said, "Crawford, I'm tired. Where can I rest?" With a smile, Sean led the way. The Crawford family's driver was already waiting outside. The trio got into the car, with Frida sitting in the passenger seat. Sean and Peregrine sat in the back. The latter would pipe up occasionally, asking Sean about how the Crawford family was doing lately. Though Peregrine acted high and mighty, Sean did not show any signs of impatience. After all, Peregrine was indeed a capable man. He was not the one who dubbed himself the King of Medicine. Instead, it was a title his peers in the medical field had been calling him by in the past few decades. In fact, Peregrine almost joined the State Secrets Protection Department because of his skills. Sadly, an explosion that happened during a research and development project 16 years ago injured and even killed many of Peregrine's men, causing him to lose his will to go on. The explosion had happened because of him. Although he was not subject to criminal liability since it was an accident, he already labeled himself as an unforgivable sinner. Ever since then, Peregrine had disappeared from everyone's sight and even declined the government's invitation. Sean was merely trying his luck when he went to ask Peregrine for his help. When Peregrine was severely injured some time ago, it was the Crawford family who had helped and bore the medical expenses for him and his disciples. The elderly man owed them a debt of gratitude. When Alistair Crawford fell seriously ill years later, the Crawford invited Peregrine out of seclusion to treat him. In other words, the Crawford and Peregrine had called it quits. Sean had gone to look for Peregrine, not knowing if he would agree to come out of seclusion. Fortunately, the elderly man still appreciated the kindness of the Crawford family. When Sean arrived at his residence and expressed his intentions, Peregrine only hesitated for a moment before agreeing to his request. Back then, the Crawford family saved so many of my disciples. Every life they had saved was a debt I owed. When you asked me to save another person's life, I've no reason to refuse your request. I'll do it. That had been Peregrine's response. He wasted no time and joined Sean on their way to the airport, disregarding the need to pack his belongings. Even Sean found it hard to believe how smoothly everything went. How is old Mr. Queen doing? After asking about the Crawford family's current situation and learning that Alistair was in the pink of health, Peregrine turned to Frida, simply asking out of concern for an old friend. Frida replied respectfully, My grandfather also fell ill recently, but he has just recovered. Do you have the time to visit him and provide treatment for him once more? She was trying to get in his good books. However, Peregrine was not buying it. It's good that he has recovered. Someone as kind as him will get through anything. I'm only good at pharmacology, so I won't be of great help to him. His children and grandchildren should take good care of him instead. Sensing Frida's attempt to flatter him, Peregrine closed his eyes, leaned back in his chair, and drifted off to sleep after uttering those words. Frida was left in a state of awkward silence. None of them uttered a single word throughout the journey. An hour later, the car they traveled in slowly came to a halt at the entrance of a mansion in the suburbs. Sean woke Peregrine up in a low voice. I didn't take you to the city because I know you appreciate a peaceful environment. This mansion has everything you need, so please make yourself at home. Peregrine remained silent and simply nodded his head in response. He straightened his clothing with a quick pat before gracefully stepping out of the car. Frida and Sean followed behind. Frida's face turned grim after Peregrine rejected her twice. She had no idea what skills he possessed, but felt the elderly man had a more inflated ego than her grandfather. What's so great about this man anyway? He better not make a fool of himself later. Old Mr. Lomax holds an esteemed position in the medical field, so it's understandable for him to exude a certain level of confidence, Sean said in consolation despite feeling displeased by her behavior. Hearing his words, Frida forced a smile. Once they arrived at the mansion, Sean arranged for Peregrine to have breakfast and rest before discussing the next course of action. Old Mr. Lomax, we can't delay any longer as the patient's condition is not optimistic. But since I'm not convenient to appear in person, may I get Miss Queen to introduce you instead? Sean asked for Peregrine's consent respectfully. The elderly man nodded without expressing any opinion. Peregrine arrived with a clear intention to treat the patient and was not concerned about who would introduce him later. Seeing Peregrine nod in agreement, Sean gave Frida a few additional instructions before sending her back to the Queen family to explain the situation. Frida returned to the Queen residence right away. Jonathan was listening to his assistant's report in the house. Out of all the invitations they had sent, a few reclusive famous doctors were unable to attend while the others had declined the request altogether. In short, not one of them accepted the invitation. Jonathan understood those reclusive experts, who could be experienced and set in their ways, probably had plans of their own. The Queens were not particularly close to the reclusive experts they had invited, so they thought using Alfred's name to reach out to them might help. Under normal circumstances, Jonathan would not have handled their rejection well, but the fact that his closest friend's partner was in danger caused him to feel a sense of panic. Jonathan stood up anxiously. Buy me a plane ticket. I'll go there and meet them in person." The assistant could only stay silent and keep up with him. When they were about to leave the mansion, they bumped into Frida, who was entering the house. Jonathan, where are you going?" "I found someone who can save Roxanne." Frida's expression lacked joy. Instead, a hint of smugness lingered on her face as she conveyed the news to Jonathan. Upon noticing the expression on Jonathan's face, she knew he had not found anyone. "Yes, I won." Jonathan was visibly anxious and eager to find out the expert she had managed to contact. Who did you manage to get?" Frida cleared her throat and said, I spoke to someone who provided me with the contact of Peregrine Lomax. Morania's king of medicine. Jonathan's eyes widened in shock. Peregrine Lomax? You managed to get him to come. Frida's guilt flickered momentarily across her face, but she quickly regained her composure. I told him about the patient's condition and that she was Dr. Lambert's apprentice. I also mentioned that I was from the Queen family. I think he may have agreed to help because of Grandpa and Dr. Lambert. But he did request a reward of 10 million. Lucian wouldn't mind spending such a small amount of money, would he? It was not difficult to spot the loopholes in Frida's story, but Jonathan did not have the mental capacity to worry about that. Jonathan confirmed with Frida. Are you sure that person is Peregrine Lomax? Where is he now, and when will he arrive? Frida did not like the way he questioned her. Yes, he is Peregrine Lomax. I arranged for him to rest in the suburbs, but he should arrive soon. Jonathan hesitated for a moment but decided to trust Frida's words. I have no choice but to believe her. Okay, I'll contact Lucian right now. You go pick up old Mr. Lomax. We'll go to the hospital immediately once he arrives. Reluctantly, Frida agreed and left to call Sean. She asked him to get someone to send Peregrine to the city while she would wait for him at a designated location, hoping to minimize the travel time. Jonathan immediately called Lucian and told him the good news. Even though Frida might not have heard of Peregrine, Jonathan knew very well who he was. Besides Jack, old Mr. Lomax will be the only other person in the world who can save Roxanne. Upon learning that Frida had invited a renowned doctor over and hearing Jonathan's effusive praise for the doctor, Lucian felt his body begin to stiffen. 10 million is nothing to me. I'll even pay him 100 million or even 1 billion. The legendary king of medicine was his and Roxanne's last hope. Jonathan also took the opportunity to put in a good word for his sister. We should thank Frida for bringing him here. Lucian responded in a deep voice. I'll repay your kindness generously if he can cure Roxanne. Jonathan muttered a casual response before hanging up the phone. I don't expect you to repay my kindness. My only hope is that you won't hold a grudge against Frida anymore. It did not take long for Frida to bring the man over. She only took an hour. Jonathan quickly greeted, old Mr. Lomax. Peregrine studied the siblings for a moment before turning to speak to Jonathan in a nicer tone. Where's your grandfather? Jonathan furrowed his brows and said, my grandpa isn't in the pink of health. He has been recuperating away from the house recently. If you want to meet him, I'll bring you to him after you treat my friend. Then, fearing that the elderly man would misunderstand his words, he quickly added, my friend's condition is terrible, and she can't afford to waste any more time. Please forgive me for making you travel this far. Peregrine seemed satisfied with his attitude, for he nodded his head and said, it's fine. Saving a life is more important. Where's the patient? Jonathan immediately replied, she's at the hospital. I'll bring you to her right now. With that, he strode forward to lead the way. Frida deliberately walked at a slower pace to stay by Peregrine's side in an attempt to make her seem closer to him. After they got into the car, Jonathan drove them to the hospital in a swift but steady manner. A while later, the car came to a stop by the entrance of the hospital. Lucian was already waiting downstairs. After listening to Jonathan's introduction, Lucian figured out that the reclusive experts were prideful individuals. The humbler he showed himself to be, the better the impression they would have of him. That way, they would do their best to treat Roxanne. Lucian, this is old Mr. Lomax, Peregrine Lomax, a master in medicine. Jonathan was surprised to find Lucian waiting for them downstairs, but he soon realized why Lucian was there. He quickly introduced, old Mr. Lomax, this is the current head of the Farwell family, Lucian Farwell. Lucian lowered his head a little and reached out his hand to Peregrine. I'm sorry for the trouble, old Mr. Lomax. I've already hired famous doctors all over the world to treat her, but none knew how. I hope that you'll be able to give us a tip or two. Peregrine nodded, but he did not shake Lucian's hand. Etiquettes are not important to me. Bring me to her now." Without hesitation, Lucian retracted his arm and led the way. Peregrine was impressed by Lucian's decisive demeanor. Once they reached the top floor, the doctors were stunned to find out who had come. They were all middle-aged individuals who had heard about the King of Medicine of Morania 16 years ago. In fact, they had heard of him from the news too. They had been young when they learned he had become a hermit, and they felt wistful about the matter. Little did they expect to see him in person that day. The second the man of the legends came, silence draped over the corridor. However, Peregrine ignored them and followed Lucian into the ward. Upon seeing Roxane's complexion, Peregrine uttered, What's going on now? How much do you know about her condition?" Lucian was not well versed in medical jargon, so he turned to look at Madeline. Madeline instantly took out the results of Roxane's various checkups since the day before. She then started explaining the data and how Roxane had been poisoned to Peregrine. Lucian added, "I've asked the one who poisoned her about this, and he said that he used a mixture of the 4 peculiar poisons and made Roxane inhale it over time in the form of essential oil. Once she inhales a certain amount, the poison will start to do its job." Peregrine narrowed his eyes as he went through the results. When he heard Lucian's words, a dubious look crossed his face. Was she really poisoned by essential oil? Lucian nodded in certainty. He wouldn't dare to lie to me at that time. Peregrine drew his brows together when he received Lucian's reply. Then he shook his head. Everyone was confused, for they did not know what Peregrine meant by that, but they did not dare to ask him why either. After a long silence, they finally heard Peregrine say, "The 4 peculiar poisons are the 4 peculiar poisons of ancient times. They are Crimson Crane, Evacero Gras, Final Day, and Mad Grin. They aren't real, and so there's no way you can get your hands on them." In other words, Jack was still telling him nonsense. Lucian's eyes darkened before a murderous look flashed in them. He could not believe that Jack had lied to him even when he was in that situation. If someone were to take his words seriously and started a treatment plan for Roxane according to his words, Roxane would certainly be on the verge of death by then. Suppressing his anger, Lucian asked politely, "Ye old Mr. Lomax, what do you think about Roxane's condition then?" Peregrine turned to look at Roxane in silence for a while before saying, All of you must leave. I need to give her a detailed checkup." No one dared to object to that. Despite their worries for Roxane, they all left the room. Even Lucian was standing by the entrance, looking into the room through the window on the door. He knew that Peregrine truly wanted to give Roxane a checkup, but he dared not let Roxane leave his line of sight with her current condition. Lucian, old Mr. Lomax is a capable man. I'm sure he'll be able to cure Roxane. Jonathan reassured Lucian. Even Madeline bobbed her head in agreement. Apart from Lucian, there was no one else in the world who was more worried about Roxane than her. However, as an individual in the medical field, she had heard of the King of Medicine of Morania. Madeline was confident in Peregrine's ability to treat Roxane. Despite their reassurances, Lucian only nodded at them as he continued to fix his gaze on Roxane. Peregrine grabbed Roxane's wrist and started taking her pulse with a solemn look. Once he was done with that, he pulled her eyelids up and checked her lips. He seemed to have discovered something, but through the window, Lucian could only see Peregrine's lips moving as if he was muttering something under his breath. A moment later, Peregrine frowned and strode toward the door. Lucian shifted to the side to open up a path for him. Summon the doctors who treated her yesterday." Peregrine snapped at Lucian. The doctors, who were standing nearby, shared a look with each other when they heard that. Still, they steeled themselves and went over to Peregrine. Madeline quietly stood at the side as well. What did you diagnose her with?" Peregrine asked mercilessly as he stared at the reputable doctors. The doctors kept their heads hung low as if they were students faced with a teacher asking them questions that they could not answer. Their faces were red. Peregrine snorted. The young ones nowadays make horrible doctors. Despite the degrading words, no one dared to say anything in retort. No one but Madeline. She asked anxiously, Old Mr. Lomax, we're not as knowledgeable as we should be, and we'll work harder to improve ourselves in medicine from now on. But please don't leave us hanging right now. What's wrong with Roxanne? In an icy voice, Peregrine uttered, can't you tell? She's been poisoned. That was something Lucian had told them a long time ago, so they knew about it, but they had not been able to find the symptoms of poisoning. In contrast, Peregrine had managed to come to that conclusion by himself. The patient's arteries are hardening. If this goes on, the blood might burst through the hardened arteries and that'll lead to life-threatening bleeding inside the body. If you let the condition worsen to that point, the patient will be in mortal danger. Peregrine stared at the doctors grimly. The crowd inhaled sharply as fear crept into their hearts. No wonder Mrs. Farwell's arteries became so narrow, as someone muttered under their breath. Peregrine had a keen hearing, and he lifted his feet to deliver a light kick on that person's leg. Why didn't you look more into it if you've already discovered that? That person was not expecting a kick from Peregrine, but he was not at all angry about it. In fact, he was embarrassed. After all, Peregrine was the role model they admired back when they were younger. It was an honor to be taught a lesson by their role model. The person lowered his head and told Peregrine what happened the night before, adding, We've already done all the tests we could, but we couldn't find what was making Mrs. Farwell's arteries narrow and expand. It's only after your diagnosis did we realize what was going on. A beat later, he continued guiltily, Mrs. Farwell was fine during her stay in the hospital up until last night. She returned to her initial state after our treatment. There was nothing strange at all. The lack of anything strange is what's strangest. Peregrine kept his hands behind his back as a grave expression crossed his face. Dangerous changes are going on in her, but you doctors didn't even realize that. The other doctors kept their heads lowered. Peregrine looked at them the same way he looked at his past students. Without realizing it, he began to explain Roxanne's condition in detail to them. However, some were still confused by his explanation. Old Mr. Lomax, we know about that, but what do we do now? Peregrine snapped his brows together. Do you really need to ask me that despite how clear I've made things out to be? Find a way to relax her arteries. Otherwise, she might not even be able to stay alive 3 days later. Everyone's hearts lurched when they heard that, and the doctors quickly inclined their heads before working on their respective tasks. Peregrine continued to watch them with somber eyes as the other doctors busied away. At the same time, there was a hint of disappointment in his eyes. Old Mr. Lomax, how long do you think Roxanne will be able to hang on for? Lucian was crestfallen as he listened to Peregrine's words earlier. When Peregrine heard Lucian's voice, he came back to his senses and shook his head grimly. Things aren't looking good for her. Lucian fixed his gaze on the elderly man as he waited for the latter to continue. Turning to the hospital bed, Peregrine asked, who is she to you? I'll be honest with you. Roxanne is my wife and the mother to my 3 children. I'll be willing to do anything as long as you cure her. His words were respectful but assertive. Peregrine's frown deepened, but he was not irked by Lucian's tone. I'll be frank with you too. You look ill. Lucian pursed his lips in silence. He had neither slept nor rested for 2 whole days. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips were chapped, and he barely had any color to his face. Peregrine continued slowly, she wouldn't survive past the 2nd day if I hadn't come. A flame of hope began burning in Lucian's heart. However, what came out of Peregrine's mouth next extinguished that flame. But I can't come up with a plan right away. I'll need to do some research first. The light in Lucian's eyes went out. Will Roxanne be able to hang on until you're done? The look on Peregrine's face darkened. Getting her arteries to relax will take 3 days. If I haven't come up with anything in 3 days, then... Peregrine did not finish his sentence, but those present could guess what he was going to say. If Peregrine could not come up with a treatment plan in 3 days, Roxanne would die. That was a fact unless Lucian were to accept Jack's request. Although he had mentally prepared himself for that possibility, Peregrine's words were still like a dagger that stabbed Lucian in the heart. Madeline and Jonathan were taken aback. Even old Mr. Lomax can't think of a way to treat her? How ruthless is Jack? The two tried not to show the dismay on their faces. In a calm tone, Jonathan asked, Old Mr. Lomax, is there anything we can help you with?" Peregrine nodded. "Where is the library? I need to do some research." Jonathan instantly answered, I know a library meant for those in the medical field. The books there have been sorted according to their genres, and they have many collections there. Shall we have no time to waste, so let's head there right now." Jonathan immediately led Peregrine out with Frida. Soon, Madeline and Lucian were the only ones left in the corridor. "I'm going to go inside to take a look at Roxanne. Mr. Farwell, do you want to join me?" Madeline asked, trying not to look sad. Lucian gave a long look at the woman surrounded by doctors in the ward before looking away and shaking his head. Madeline could finally be sure that the man before her truly loved her good friend at the sight of his desolation. She was moved, but a wave of melancholy washed over her as well. She could not help but feel that their relationship had been a tumultuous one. Roxanne will be fine. I trust her, and you should have faith in her too," Madeline said to him. With that, she turned around and went into the ward, tears springing into her eyes. Madeline had always been a tough individual, and she did not like shedding tears in front of anyone. Roxanne was the only one she felt comfortable enough to laugh and cry around. But now, the friend Madeline could be herself around was lying on the hospital bed, and she did not know if Roxanne would survive. Madeline did not even know who she should look for to vent the sorrow she felt. Soon, Madeline and Lucian were the only ones left in the corridor. She walked over to the bed, and looking at her good friend's colorless face, she grabbed her hand. "Roxanne, you have to hang on. We're waiting for you. You have to get well soon." After taking a few seconds to calm herself down, Madeline sniffled and forced her tears away before readying herself to join the rest of the doctors. Lucian was standing in the corridor by himself. He was only a few steps away from Roxanne's bed, but he could not bring himself to lift his leg. Every time he looked at the woman's face, the ache in his heart would worsen. He dared not imagine what would happen 3 days later. If no one could think of a way to resolve Roxanne's condition after 3 days, then he would have to agree to Jack's requests and marry another woman. Everything about Roxanne would have nothing to do with him anymore. Roxanne had kept a distance from him even when Aubrey was only his fiancée in name back then. He was certain that she would be disgusted with him and would despise him if she were to wake up and find out that he had married another woman. The veins on Lucian's arms bulged, and he vented his rage by swinging a fist at the wall. "There's nothing much to be done. I have to let her go even if she will hate me for it. I'll do anything to save her life, including submitting to Jack." After an exhausting day in the ward, Madeline emerged and was surprised to see Lucian standing at the door. Have you been standing here this whole time?" Lucian nodded. How is she?" Madeline sighed. It's too early to tell. We've softened up her arteries a little and will continue doing so tomorrow. You should go in and keep her company." Lucian gazed at the figure inside but somehow could not move his feet. Roxanne would want you by her side," Madeline said. It was only then that Lucian's gaze softened. A moment's hesitation later, he walked in. After standing guard outside the ward through the night and seeing no change in Roxanne's condition, Lucian did not feel his anxiety alleviated in the slightest. Peregrine's words weighed heavily on his heart. He knew a change was taking place within her body that was invisible to the naked eye. At the first light of dawn, Madeline and the team of experts entered the ward to pick up where they had left off the day before. Lucian rose to leave. This time, he no longer stood guard at the door. Peregrine had not returned, but it was time for his appointment with Colby. He was anxious to see if Colby had come up with anything. Lucian sped all the way until he arrived at the prison entrance. Having been too hasty in his arrival, he had forgotten to inform his friend ahead of time. Fortunately, the guard who had greeted him the day before hurried over at once, having just started his shift. "Are you here to see Colby Galloway again, Mr. Farwell?" Lucian nodded expressionlessly. With a tactful nod, the guard relayed an order to have Colby brought out. The pair met once again in the visiting room. Still bounded by shackles, Colby remained under the guard's watchful eyes but regarded Lucian with less hostility this time. The pair sat across from one another in silence. As the minutes passed, Lucian's heart sank. If Colby had thought of something, he would not waste any time by telling me the second he saw me. He also wouldn't have that look on his face. The pair did not speak. Lucian nodded. I got it. It's all right. I'll think of something else." Just as he was about to leave, Colby piped up. Surely you've made some progress over the past 2 days. Any other clues? Tell me. Perhaps I could think of something." Lucian paused at those words. He returned to his seat and relayed Peregrine's diagnosis once more. Her arteries have hardened, and the constriction in her circulation is causing them to contract further. Colby repeated Lucian's words with bewilderment in his eyes. Lucian inclined his head as an affirmation of his summary. After several minutes of silence, Colby looked up gravely. Who discovered this?" He was not convinced of the severity of whatever poison that was. "Mr. Peregrine Lomax. He is said to be the king of medicine of Morania. You might have heard of him." Despite not knowing much about the medical world, Lucian was aware of the old man's prestige from the expert's reverence for him. Old Mr. Lomax. Colby's eyes were filled with shock at Lucian's words. He even managed to hire old Mr. Lomax. Even more surprisingly, old Mr. Lomax couldn't handle Roxanne's condition. Otherwise, Lucian would not have come to see me today. What else did the old gentleman say? He was desperate to hear Peregrine's diagnosis. Lucian shook his head, his expression dark. Old Mr. Lomax is still perusing the medical literature for a way to cure Roxanne. Colby turned grim, his eyes thoughtful. Let me mull it over. I will think of something. I am in prison while Roxanne lies on a hospital bed with her life at stake. Even old Mr. Lomax couldn't save her. I need to do something for her, no matter what it takes. Lucian's words played over and over again in his mind. Colby's brows were furrowed as he tried to decipher any information he could from those words. However, despite racking his brain, he could not think of any medicinal herbs that could match the drug's efficacy. Colby grew frustrated. Dr. Jarvis spent most of her time in the laboratory. She is susceptible to the smells of medicinal herbs, including rare specimens that have passed through her hands. She would have noticed something if she smelled something poisonous, and Jack knows this. Swiftly, he arrived at a possibility. To disguise the smell of the medicinal herbs, he must have used a good amount of fragrance. You don't push yourself if you can't come up with anything. Lucian felt touched at the sight of Colby's panic. As you said, despite old Mr. Lomax's skill, there isn't anything he could do now. Colby regained his composure, though there were traces of defeat in his gaze. If old Mr. Lomax could come up with something, Dr. Jarvis would be delighted upon waking to find out that it was he who had saved her. Lucian looked at him in puzzlement. Why do you say that? He knew the old man was a legend in the medical industry and that it would not be unusual for Roxanne to idolize him, but Colby's words seemed to indicate something else. Remembering something, Colby said, I have worked with Dr. Jarvis to develop several medications that would undoubtedly be of great interest to the industry, some of which were based on old Mr. Lomax's research. He should have had a share in the profits. Peregrine had disappeared without warning years ago and left behind much half-done research. He had even released it to the world, hoping that somebody would take over and produce something with his research. Many within the medical industry became interested and began conducting follow-up research. However, Roxanne was the only one who had led them to perfect the drugs. They had tried to contact Peregrine, but to no avail. Roxanne had been uneasy about being unable to share the profits with him, so she had set the price of the drugs low enough just to break even and recoup the costs to pay tribute to the man they otherwise owed. It was this incident that had given Colby his first good impression of Roxanne. In their subsequent encounters, the fondness increased until it became an obsession. At the recollection of the past and of the foolish things he had done, Colby could not help resenting himself. Lucian's gaze dimmed when he listened to how Roxanne and Peregrine met. She would be thrilled if she woke up and learned that old Mr. Lomax had treated her. But given the current situation, keeping her safe is... If there is no other way, I can only give Jack what he wants, he said expressionlessly. Colby was taken aback. Jack gave you his conditions? What are they? There must be a catch for Lucian to be thinking twice. Lucian's grim gaze met his. You only need to know one of them. He wants me to marry another woman before Roxanne regains consciousness. Is he crazy? How could he make you do that? Lucian gave a self-deprecating laugh. It was my negligence that resulted in Roxanne's predicament. I should pay the price. It is a heavy price to pay. Colby looked at the man before him, still in shock, as his expression shifted. He would sacrifice his marriage for Roxanne's safety. He recalled the time he had first heard Roxanne's story 6 years ago. He had been disgusted with Lucian and thought him unworthy of her. Then Roxanne returned to the country 6 years later. Upon finding out about their union, Colby held on to the notion that Lucian's sin was unpardonable and realized that it was wishful thinking to envision a future with her. Now, it seems the person most worthy of Roxanne is the man before me. He is the only one who truly loves her to be willing to give anything for her. My and Jack's feelings for her, on the other hand, are only excuses we have used to hurt her. What I have done is unforgivable. After chiding himself derisively, Colby looked up at Lucian with a look of disapproval. No, you can't just let him have his way. Lucian furrowed his brows at those words. Jack is doing this to drive a wedge between you, Colby said quietly. If you do as he asked, he will get what he wants. You and Dr. Jarvis have stayed together all these years. Shouldn't that count for something? Hold on to the very end, for her sake. If she knows this, I think she will fight to her dying breath for you and the children. As if sensing his inappropriate tone, Colby took a deep breath, his features hard with resolve, as he continued, You need to have more faith in her and us doctors. We will definitely think of something. Those were the last words Lucian expected from him. A complicated mix of emotions arose in his eyes. You would see me with Roxanne? He asked, unable to contain himself. He remembered how relentless Colby had been just to draw Roxanne's attention to his existence. Even after his arrest, Colby had insisted he did nothing wrong. However, at that moment, he seemed to have become another person. Colby's eyes flashed, and he averted his gaze stiffly. Before today, I have always thought you were unworthy of Dr. Jarvis. Nobody was good enough for her. Even I myself am far from worthy. He then turned quickly to glance at Lucian. I have seen how much you are willing to sacrifice for her. Dr. Jarvis likes you, and you treat her well. That's good enough. She's better off with you than with somebody with impure motives.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.